Todd Anderson here. I had the privilege of actually planting a couple of churches with Central District, and it's a good district. They have a heart for church planting. Church planting is very interesting. It very much compares to farming. Planting is when you first put the seed in the soil, you watch it sprout, you watch it grow up. It's very much like gardening. It's the same thing that you do. When you do church planting, you're concerned about starting something new. When you do church renewal, you're actually coming alongside of somebody that's already been planted. It may have been 10 years, 20, it can be 30. But they're struggling at that time, and they need shoring up. They need strengthening. And so that's the difference between church planting and church renewal. Well, church planting is extremely critical. They've discovered that church planting is the number one way to reach new people for Jesus Christ. Young churches draw new people. Sometimes what happens is people are afraid to go to an established church, but they'll go to something new. I don't always understand the psyche of it all, but I will tell you, I've had more people come to know Christ, and that will happen within the first 5 to 10 years of that church. And then after that, we tend to lose the focus on conversion and are more in the focus of how do we sustain.
Can be broken down, I think, into 3 systems: tending, extending, and sending. Most churches are just tending churches, right? And even less churches are extending churches, or reaching beyond the 4 walls of our church, which I think is why there isn't an urgency for church planting. But then sending is even more minimal. When my wife and I, when we got married, we essentially said, hey, we want to have kids. Kids are a natural outflow of a covenant between a man and a woman. And if Paul was correct that he likened the church to a family and a body, then the system of church planting is ingrained in the mission of the church, which means that once a church is in covenant with Christ, the natural outflow is always more kids, right? And so when we talk about level 4, it really is, when you look at the life of Paul, we see his life. We see that naturally, that MDNA, that missional DNA that was really planted in him. We see that his missionary journeys led to more and more people come to Christ. It is the foundation of our faith, Matthew 28, right? Like it's from the Jerusalem Council all the way up until here. The question has always been, how do we help and see the kingdom of this world become the kingdoms of our God? And so when we think about level 4 churches, I mentioned that only 7% of churches are even reproducing in America.
From my perspective as a church historian, I would look at church renewal as almost a synonym for revival, and certainly in terms of American history as well as in terms of the history of the church over the last 2,000 years. There have been just series or waves of revival that have swept through the church. In England, in Wales, the Great Welsh Revival of 1905. In the United States, there have been 4 major revivals that have significantly impacted the church as an institution, as well as the broader culture more generally. So if we're talking about church renewal, I would talk about church renewal as revival. Well, if you're not interested in church renewal or revival, the church is going to die.
Okay.
It's that, to me, it's that simple, it's that basic, because you see some of those themes in the New Testament, actually. I would look, for example, at Revelation chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 3, where Jesus Christ is addressing 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia at that time in the latter part of the first century. And every one of those churches, it starts with Ephesus and ends with Laodicea, but every one of those churches, Jesus is saying something to that church. And how people interpret and apply it in the 21st century, there's some different ways people do that. But nonetheless, what Jesus is really talking about in each one of those is renewal. He's talking about there's some things that you at Ephesus, you have lost your first love. What does that mean? Well, I understand that to mean you've lost your first love for me. You're busy, you're doing things, but you've fallen out of love with me. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but that's what he's saying. And then, you go to Laodicea, that's the last church in the 70s, he talks about the church of Laodicea. You're lukewarm. I wish you were hot, I wish you were cold, you're lukewarm. There's complacency, there's apathy. Again, that would be words I would use in the 21st century. And Jesus is in effect saying, knock it off. Get hot for me. Again, if you use that metaphor that I think he's developing. So, to me, I look at those things in Revelation 2 and 3, or I look at, for example, what Paul is saying in the 2 Corinthian letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He's talking about them renewing. He planted those churches. Now, he's talking about there are things you need to do to deal with issues in your local church, in this case, Corinth. And you see the same thing in the book of Colossians. So, I could keep going on with that. But to me, they're some of the important things that we see in the New Testament. The church has always, in the 2,000 years of its history, has always had times where it needs to renew itself. It needs to get back to what the priorities of Jesus are. The church is Jesus' body, that organic body of Christ, that metaphor that Paul uses in the New Testament. And so we have to make sure we are lined up with what Jesus wants for his church, not what we want for his church. And so to me, that's renewal, or to use another term, that's revival.